Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our third installment of CivicCon. You know, when we held our Vibrant Community Summit a year and a half ago, which I can't believe it's been that long ago now, we made a promise at that event, I stepped up and made a promise, and much to, I think, the chagrin of some of the staff at Acadiana, made the promise that we were going to do three things, a minimum of three things, as it related to what came out of that Vibrant Community Summit. One of them was we were going to conduct the quality of life survey, which we did. We were going to provide and develop a dashboard that quantified a lot of those things that came out of that survey, as well as a number of other things that would coincide with our educational dashboard, which is part of our 55 by 25 initiative. We've done that. And the third thing that we promised is we would start the CivicCon series. You know, great communities are based and developed out of strong and great community conversations. And that's what this is designed to do. We want to raise the civic IQ. People don't know what they don't know. So we want to help people understand what makes a community vibrant, what makes a community stronger, what makes a community a place where talent wants to come and where talent wants to live and where people want to work and play. You know, we went through a strategic planning process as a staff at Acadiana, and we talked a lot about what we do. And we know what we do. Then we had a conversation about why we do it. And what it all boiled down to, and what we came up with out of that conversation was we do what we do because we love where we live, and we want other people to love it as well. So we live in a great place. We have unbelievable people in our community that are doing amazing things. If you look at Dr. Schumacher and the Love Our Schools program and what he's done with that, along with his other partners in that, phenomenal work. You look at what Matt Stuller, and I think Brianne is here as well, what Brianne has done with what they've done with the Parish Proud initiative. You know, not just a litter initiative, but a beautification initiative, making people proud of where they live. All of those things tie together to make a community more vibrant and to make our place a better place for economic development. When it all boils down to it, what we do as an economic development organization is we create and we preserve jobs. We work to do that every day. Well, this series is a big part of that. So we're really proud and excited to have so many of you here tonight. We've got a fantastic speaker that has joined us tonight. I just found out, in fact, that this man shared a stage with Paul Bunyan. He played drums in a band on a stage with Paul Bunyan behind him dancing. So does it get any better than that, right? But I'll let Chuck fill in the details on that when he comes to the stage. This would not be possible. The CivicCon series would not be possible without our presenting sponsors. I mentioned Kip Schumacher earlier, Dr. Schumacher, and the William Schumacher Family Foundation, Erica Ray, which I'm going to bring to the stage in just a moment, Carly Omlabar on staff with the foundation, in partnership with LHC Group, and I think Mark Willis, I see you up there. The light's kind of shining right there, Mark. Good to see you. Glad to have those as presenting sponsors. This wouldn't be possible without them. We also have supporting sponsors. In the Pinnacle Group is, I don't know if Mr. Rob Eddy's here. I hadn't had a chance to see Rob, but Mr. Rob Eddy with the Pinnacle Group as a supporting sponsor. And then we have some other partners in the thing. We host this here at ACA, so ACA is one of our partners, as well as the Downtown Development Authority. And I know Anita's here somewhere. She was at our workshop earlier. There's Anita over there. We appreciate those partnerships a great, great deal. And then, of course, it wouldn't be possible without our media partner, the Acadiana Advocate. So we're greatly appreciative of them and the work that they do. So with no further ado, I'm going to invite Erica Ray with the Schumacher Family Foundation to come to the stage, and she will introduce Chuck Marone.
Good evening. My name is Erica Ray, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the William C. Schumacher Family Foundation. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Kip Schumacher in the audience and his lovely wife, Ms. Carolyn Dahl Schumacher, and the newest addition to our foundation, Carly Omlabar, who is our Executive Director. So we're thrilled to be a co-sponsor, along with the other sponsors, tonight for this engagement. One of our missions, and I guess our biggest mission from the foundation side, is to engage community. and to be a catalyst for great things to happen. And so as a foundation, that's what we do, and we do it in different initiatives. One initiative is the Disaster Response Relief Division, and Dr. Schumacher always says, never miss a good opportunity that a disaster presents to bring people together. The other initiative that we have is education, and schools are places where communities are built. And so we're a co-founder of Love Our Schools, along with the Stoller Family Foundation and the Pugh Family Foundation. And we started the initiative along with several other community stakeholders in 2019. Recently, Manual Builders, Missy Manuel and Greg Manuel approached us and wanted to build a home and donate it to Love Our Schools. So another partner, Mr. Rodney Savoy, donated the land, and so the home is being built, and we decided to raffle the home. And then a cool thing happened. Other philanthropists showed up, and they were the subcontractors for the house. So the electricians became philanthropists, and they donated their time and their materials. And the roofers became philanthropists, and they donated their time and materials. And so you once again had community coming together as philanthropists. Because remember, anyone can be a philanthropist. That's what Solar Giving Day is all about, right? So as we sit here this evening, I wanted you all got one of these when you came in. So I said this is part of the program. So everyone who has the magic box, you know the magic box with the camera on it, you can scan your neighbor. Now, I'm not responsible for where they put their sticker. But the sticker is a Q code, and it goes to the Love Our Schools Foundation.org website to purchase your ticket. And the tickets are $25 each, and it goes to directly to the public schools of the Lafayette Parish Public Schools. And we were talking in our workshop earlier about how important the public schools are to our community. And we look at different sectors in verticals. And when you look at the public school system, we should all be looking at it a little more horizontally. So we're grateful today to be a co-sponsor, and we want to say that our town is a strong town, is a smart town. And so at that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chuck. So Charles Chuck Marone is, as mentioned, the founder and president of Strong Towns. He is a land use planner and now retired professional engineer with decades of experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master of urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Marone is the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity, along with Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for Strong Town. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast and serves as primary writer for Strong Towns web content. He has presented Strong Towns concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America. Having visited Lafayette multiple times, Chuck is no stranger to our community and often uses takeaways from Lafayette as insight for other presentations. Please help me welcome back to Lafayette and to the stage tonight, Chuck Marone.
It is really nice to be here again. This afternoon, I can switch to this. This afternoon I said that I think the city that I've actually been in more as a member of Strong Towns, doing conversations like this than any outside of Minnesota is this one right here. So it's an honor to be invited back. I haven't said anything that has excluded me from the city so far, so we'll keep pushing on that, see if we can cross that threshold tonight. it's interesting because you said about Paul Bunyan, that's not the most interesting person I've shared the stage with. So we'll talk about that at dinner tonight. I was telling someone the other day, I had, when I was very young, I did music in addition to engineering, which, think that through for a second, it's very weird. I have a weird career path. But I got to, I had a hot dog and nachos with the band Steppenwolf at a music festival we were both playing at. And I just wound up like backstage sitting at a picnic table with the members of Steppenwolf. And that was the point in time when I realized that I was not going to be a musician. Because these guys said, I mean, everybody knows who they are, right? Born to Be Wild and all this, which they played, I think, 3 times in their set. But I realized that, like, that would be the pinnacle. Like, if I could be that successful, you'd be really successful, and then you would wind up sitting with a teenager at a picnic table backstage of a half-baked rock concert at in the middle of nowhere. So, yeah, career goals. Anyway, enough about that. It's very nice to be here. Let me make sure we got, yes, cool. I've been asked a couple times to talk early on in the CivicCon event, and it's a very honorable thing for me to be asked to do this. I know there's a lot of responsibility in kicking off a community-wide conversation like this. The Strong Towns conversation is really about framing the way we talk about growth and development and public investment. And I'm going to give you some stuff tonight that will frame things in your community in a way that you might not have thought of before. And I'm taking some extra time here at the beginning because generally when I go and speak places, I use examples not from the community I'm in. And I learned the hard way, particularly in my own hometown, because a lot of the examples I'm going to show you tonight actually come from my little hometown in central Minnesota. When I bring them up in other places, people look at them and they're like, oh, that's very insightful, that's very revealing, like that shows me something. And when I bring them up back home, everybody has a story to explain it, and it's not as resonant. So when I speak back home, I show examples from other places, because then people can, hear them with open minds and open hearts. So I had this debate with myself coming in here tonight because I was involved 5, 6 years ago, with a big study. In fact, it was a national groundbreaking study that was done right here of your city. It's the first of its kind anywhere. It's been replicated a few times since, but we did this very in-depth financial study here. And it's some of the best data that's ever been assembled about the modern American development pattern. And it's a key part of the book that I wrote, Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution. And it's also a key part of this presentation that I've used to kick off these CivicCon series. And so my internal debate was, do I take this stuff out? Or do I show it to you with the understanding that I'm going to be talking about your place? And I think it's more respectful to keep it in there. And so I'm going to ask you tonight as we go along, I'm going to give you some examples. We're going to talk about other places. And then we're going to flash and talk about your place a little bit. I want you to try to hear it with as open a heart, as open a mind as you can. Because I show your stuff in other places, not because you are weird or different or somehow defective, but because you are a perfect encapsulation of what all cities in North America have done. You are actually a very good example of a well-executed city post-World War II and the ramifications of that. So, open hearts. I'm just asking you for some generosity. And I think before I came on, that's Miss Amy, isn't it? I love you. Thank you for being here. I was told that you might be here tonight, and I was standing over there and I saw you, and I'm like, oh, thank you. So it's so nice to see you. One of the true, when I travel around the country, I get to meet fascinating people, heroes, who are doing amazing work. Miss Amy in New Orleans, if you ever make it over there, she will be generous to you. She will show you around. She's one of the heroes of that city. And boy, we all would benefit from having someone like her in our places. So thank you for being here. I want to start this conversation talking a little bit about complexity. We all recognize that a rainforest is a complex system. When we look at a rainforest, we recognize that there's a lot of different flora and fauna. They all interact with each other in independent, novel ways. When we look at a rainforest, we see that a rainforest has a certain order to it, but we recognize that that order is not imposed on the rainforest. It emerges out of all this complexity. We can say the same things about early cities. When we look at early cities, many, many thousands of years ago, what we see is that all these different people came together and acting, in concert with each other, but independently of each other, started to build things. And the order we see is often very beautiful. It's often very interesting, but it's an order that emerges out of this complexity. It's not an order that is imposed. These are complex adaptive systems. A complex system is different than a system that is merely complicated. A Rube Goldberg machine is very complicated. In fact, its complication is a feature of it, right? We marvel at a Rube Goldberg machine because there's all this stuff going on. But everybody in this room understands that if you cut one of these strings or move one of these blocks, the Rube Goldberg machine doesn't evolve and adapt and change. It just breaks, right? It stops working. Think about your automobile engine, a very complicated machine put together by really, really intelligent people. But if you stress an automobile beyond its capacity, it doesn't evolve and become a toaster or a wash machine, right? It just breaks. It just stops working. This is the fundamental difference between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. It's this capacity and ability to adapt and evolve. When we look at a rainforest, we understand that if a rainforest is given too much rain or too much sun in any one season, it doesn't collapse, it doesn't fail. You might see different flora and fauna start to become more predominant, but it will evolve and change. But take a cornfield, which is a very complicated system designed to produce corn, and stress it, give it too much sun or too much rain. You won't see it adapt and become soybeans, right? It won't adapt and become potatoes. It just fails. It fails to be good corn. We see the same type of thing in our development pattern. When we build cities in a complex adaptive way, in a way that evolves and changes over time, what we see is that when we stress that system, yes, it will adapt and it will evolve and it will change, but it doesn't collapse. It doesn't cease to function. But when we look at modern development, what we're looking at is a system where we go out and we build in large tracts all at once, and we build to a finished state. We build things to be complete. They are done. The lack of adaptability is, in a sense, the front page of the marketing brochure. When we buy something in today's development pattern, we are buying something that is finished that we do not expect to evolve and change. That lack of adaptability is a feature that is sold to us, not a flaw in the system. I want us to begin this presentation by recognizing how different that is from the way we historically have built places. This is my hometown. I come from Brainerd, Minnesota, home of Paul Bunyan, among other things. Usually when I go speak someplace, they'll say, was that the movie Fargo? Yes, that's the movie Fargo. That's where I'm from. I grew up on a farm homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents. I married my junior high girlfriend, and we've been married 27 years, and I still live in this city. I'm going to have a senior in high school this year and a sophomore, my two daughters, and so another generation. This is what my city looked like in 1871. So we just celebrated last year, our 150th year. This is year number 1. And I want to point out what you're looking at, because what you're looking at is the very first iteration of a city. This is how every city prior to the modern era, this is how every city began. Some little pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future. This is how Lafayette started out, right? This is how Shreveport began, how New Orleans began. We had a few people who showed up in our case, cut down some trees, planed out the wood, and then popped up the cheapest buildings that they could. We built thousands and thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. It's the wrong people, the wrong place, the wrong time, whatever. What would happen when a place like this would fail? Did Wall Street need a bailout because of a housing crisis? Did unemployment skyrocket? Did we have to have an act of Congress? Of course not. These were little bets. A few people betting a little bit. They would salvage what they can and they would move on to the next place. We built thousands of these, and many times they were successful, right? For complex reasons. It was the right people in the right place at the right time. And when they were successful, a city like this would grow in a very predictable way. It would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. And let me describe the actual mechanism here because it's important for us to understand it. As more and more people would move to a place like this, the land value would start to go up. More people wanted to be in this place, and the land value would actually go up. At the same time, these cheap little pop-up buildings would do what? They would start to fall apart because they're not meant to last. These buildings are not meant to last 100 years, right? They're just cheap pop-up little buildings. They would start to fall apart. That combination of rising land values with declining structure values creates a natural redevelopment pressure where people would buy up these places, tear down what was there, and build something new. And so after 30 years later, this exact same street would look like this. This is the exact same street a generation later. This is 1904. And as more and more people moved to this city, the city would continue to grow up, continue to grow out, continue to become more intense, all incrementally over time. And you would eventually see land values go up enough and structures decline to where these 2- and 3-story wood structures would be replaced with buildings of brick and granite. When we go to your downtown today and look at it, we have to understand and grasp that we're not looking at something that was built in its original form. We're actually looking at the second, third generation in some cases of buildings that were iterated in your place. This is the way cities always grew. They grew by evolving over time, by changing, by adapting. I want you to have in your mind as well, when this street looked like this, if we went a couple blocks off of this street, what kind of development pattern would we expect to see? Something that looked a little bit like this, right? It was in a different phase of its development. And if we went a couple blocks off of that, you would see buildings that were of this intensity. And so in a community like this, there in a sense is a place for everybody to plug in. If you're a poor upstart just getting going, there's a place for you kind of out towards the edge where you can plug in at a very low amount. If you're a little bit wealthier, you can maybe buy something internally, redevelop it, see that next period. If you are a big bank and you've got a city now that's been around for 50, 60 years and you're pretty sure it's going to be successful, you can come in and build your big granite bank and have a very nice hotel next to it and all that kind of stuff. This is the evolution of cities. And if we look at your city today, we see a city that evolved and evolved and evolved and then reached a point where that evolution stopped because we switched development patterns. We switched from a system of complex adaptation and iteration to one of building all at once to a finished state. Here's what this exact street looks like today in my hometown. It is a collection of vacant parking lots and half-occupied buildings. And I'm going to focus on one aspect here of this street. Look at the amount of public investment that is there. There's actually $500,000 in those 2 blocks invested in the asphalt, the sidewalks, the drainage systems, the street lights, the sewer, the water, add it all up. It's a massive public investment. Where is the wealth that my community will tap into to pay to take care of all of that infrastructure investment? It used to be there, right? It used to be there in huge amounts. It is no longer there. And this is a fundamental mistake. This is a fundamental challenge that cities across North America face. When we go through your downtown here today, I know your downtown to you feels like there's a lot of stuff packed into a small place. But if you actually step back and look at it, your downtown is nothing but gaps. massive, massive gaps where you have made huge public investment without getting the private sector type of investment that you need to pay for it. I want to talk about why this happened. Uh-oh, someone took out my middle slide. Okay, we'll do it without the middle slide. There's a blank slide in here. My guess is whoever I set my presentation to was trying to be smart and said, oh, you screwed up and put a blank slide in here. No, I didn't. So, imagine a blank slide. I want to talk about this transition and why this transition happened. Because it happened for very good reasons and very understandable reasons. And I am one of these people who I can look back in time and try to recognize with generosity in my heart why people did things that today seem so damaging and so dumb, right? But they were human like we are today. And I think part of this is recognizing that we are also going to make mistakes that people a generation or two from now are going to look at us and say, why did they do something so damaging and so dumb? I think it's important for us to look back with as generous a hearts as we can. I'll start this story with this. My grandfather grew up in the Great Depression. He was a Marine in World War II, just to give you a sense of his age. So he was in that, 1819 in World War II. He was the first group into Nagasaki after they dropped the bomb. So that would give you a sense of his age during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, his mother passed away, his dad couldn't raise him, and he wound up moving in with the neighbors. He worked their farm, and the neighbors allowed him to sleep in the barn. This is Minnesota, so there was no heat in the barn. They let him sleep in the barn, and they would feed him. In exchange, he worked the farm. He told me many times how fortunate he was during the Great Depression. So we can set our baseline for hardship there, right? This guy who felt very fortunate. My takeaway from this was that the Depression was a really hard time. My grandfather told me once, he goes, without FDR, I would have died. That seemed hyperbole to me, but I think the takeaway was, this is a really difficult time. High levels of unemployment, high levels of economic dislocation. All of a sudden, things stopped working. Nobody understood why. Even today, we debate why the Great Depression happened, right? We look back and we're like, we went through the Great Depression. You can read an economist and they'll say, oh, it was the roaring 20s and the financial bubble. And then you're like, okay, well, that makes sense. And then another one says, no, it wasn't that. It was the Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy. The reality is like, we don't agree today on what caused it. They certainly had no idea what caused it. It just, things stopped working. They also didn't know how to solve it, right? If you go back and look at the New Deal was an attempt to do what? Try a whole bunch of different things and see if something would work. That's what they did during the New Deal. What got us out of the Great Depression, at least according to what you're told in junior high, was, of course, what? World War II, right? Which, think about that for a second. You have to be an economist to make that statement, right? So we're in the Depression, and now, yay, we're out of the Depression because we sent millions of people overseas to kill and to die. We drafted millions of other people into industries, creating bombs and tanks and airplanes and ships and all this stuff that was going to get blown up. But guess what? GDP went up. So like, yay, we're out of the Depression. As we got to the end of World War II, or as we were getting close to the end, if you study the history of war in the 20th century, World War I, it was not clear who was going to win until like the last 4 months. It could have gone either way. But in World War II, it became clear pretty early on who was going to win. It was just a matter of how much it would take to get to that point. So we started to hold economic conferences, the Bretton Woods Conference in like 1943. We started creating what the post-war order was going to look like. The thing that the economists of the time were freaked out about was, as soon as this war is over, we're going to go right back into the Great Depression. We haven't done nothing is different about our economy. When we bring these millions of troops back home, when we shut down all these industries, there is nothing that is going to keep our economy from going right back to 1935. Of course, that's not what happened, right? And this is where I switch from the blank slide to the next slide, because we all know what happened, right? We did something completely different. We created a brand new way of living. And we use that as the mechanism to drive what nostalgically we look back at as the greatest boom in American history, the greatest boom in world history, really. If you look back at this period of time, you recognize that this was the embodiment of a lot of hopes and dreams about the future. We could understand where we were as a country. We were the last economic power, major economic power, not decimated by war. Our industry was strong. We were bringing more oil out of the ground than Saudi Arabia. We literally had the world's gold. They shipped it to us to pay for the war and for safekeeping during the war. We had the world's reserve currency. Everybody traded in dollars. We were rebuilding the world with our steel, with our industry. We had a culture that was united in fighting common enemies. And we took all of this capital we had and we poured it into creating a new version of America. And while I recognize, I'm not trying to have complete rose-colored glasses about this. This was not a vision that included everybody. But I think if we're trying to be the most generous, we can say this was a vision that ultimately was designed to hopefully include everybody, right? The idea was we could grow a middle class, we could create single-family homes, we could build. It would get the economy roaring. That would create opportunity for everybody. We could have an ownership society. Everybody could own a little bit of America. And here's the amazing thing. It actually kind of worked. We look back on these couple decades after World War II with a lot of nostalgia today as this period of time when one wage earner could support an entire family, when we had a rising standard of living, when people could get into bigger homes, they could get longer mortgages, they could build up their equity and their wealth. Again, I'm not trying to gloss over the fact that this was designed to create a middle class, and that middle class had certain demographic conditions that did not include everybody. But I'm trying again to explain or understand why people would embark on this huge radical experiment, this massive change in our development pattern. There was a hope about what it would mean for us. In fact, let me say this, and I'm going to ask for your generosity a couple times tonight. Here's one, because I'm really not a partisan political person. If you are, I'm going to ask you to kind of tamp it down just for the next 30 seconds, because I'm going to say something that is not partisan, and I don't want you to hear it that way. If we go back to the 2016 presidential election, right? Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. There's a lot of discussion about, what that election was about and what have you. I'm going to tell you what I saw. I saw two 70-plus-year-old candidates talking about how they were going to recreate the greatest period of time in their life for us today. And whether that was a vision of Ozzie and Harriet families and blue-collar jobs, or whether that was a vision of a federal government that could be really expansive and generous and do all kinds of things like expand Social Security, start a Medicare program, do things like that, they were both talking about the exact same period of time from their youth. The 50s and 60s, the couple decades right after World War II, where this whole experiment kicked off. Let me show you what we did, because this worked. And the fact that it worked is embedded in our psyche today. What I'm going to show you right now are some maps of Fresno, California. And I'm going to show you maps of Fresno, not because I think Fresno is like the greatest example ever, but because I've got really good maps of Fresno. But you will recognize in Fresno the shift in the development pattern that I've laid out for you thus far. So here's the boundaries of Fresno in 1897. You can see the little yellow here. That's how big Fresno was. Now, I want you to watch and remember in your mind that incremental development pattern, going from the pop-up shacks to the wood structures to the brick and granite structures. I want you to imagine that going on as we go through time here. So here's that incremental pattern. Here's 1909. Now we're at 1922. Now we're in the middle of the Great Depression. And now we're at the end of World War II. And you can see that Fresno has grown, right? Fresno is growing up. They're growing out. They're growing incrementally more intense. The city is thickening up. This is that traditional development pattern, that pattern that we saw literally around the world for thousands of years. We can look at cities and they were built in this way. Now we start this new experiment, this new version of America. We're going to pump money into highways. We're going to pump money into infrastructure. We're going to subsidize single-family homes. And we are going to put our economy on steroids so that we stay out of the Great Depression. And here's what the development pattern now looks like. So 1958, 1970, 1983. Here's the mid-90s. And the last one I've got here is 2010. And you can see, right, like this is what you guys did here, right? This is what we did in my city. This is what every city in North America did, not because we're all really smart, not because we're all really dumb, but because this is what our national macroeconomic policy was. Let's pump money into expanding cities very, very, very quickly. Again, I'm going to say, the goal was to keep us out of the Great Depression, and this worked. It kept us out of the Great Depression. It energized our economy, and it created these couple of decades of incredible growth that we still nostalgize today. Now we're going to talk about some of the challenges that this created economically. And this is the first instance where I'm going to use numbers from your community. These are numbers I share with everybody, and I share them because they're a great example of the trade-offs. At the end of World War II, your population here in Lafayette, Louisiana was a little over 33,000. In 2015, it was 121,000. That's a 3.5 times the amount of growth, right? It's a tremendous amount of growth. In the post-war era, you have seen an astounding amount of growth. But when we go back to the end of 1945 and we say, what did it take to provide drinking water for the people of Lafayette? At the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person. Today, it takes 10 times that amount, 50 feet of pipe per person. What does it take to provide fire protection for the people of this community? Well, at the end of World War II, it took 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today, it takes 21 times that amount. So we look at it through the lens of local government, through the lens of a local community, through the lens of us living in a place. And what we see is that we can create lots and lots and lots of growth, but it requires us to take on accelerating levels of liability, accelerating levels of future promises, accelerating levels of maintenance obligations that we as a community now have. Now, the reaction that I get sometimes to this, I'm going to enunciate it so we're all on the same page, is, okay, Chuck, I get it, but my gosh, we're so much wealthier today than we were back then. We're so much richer today than we were back then. Who would want to live the way we lived at the end of the World War II? We have bigger homes, we have more cars, we have more stuff, we have a higher standard of living. We're so much better off today than we were back then, and that's reflected in these numbers. To which I say, okay, where does that show up, really? Because if we look at the end of World War II, and these are adjusted for inflation, so they're the same, they're 2015 dollars. At the end of World War II, a family living here in this community was making $27,700. Today, while your liabilities have gone up 10 times and 20 times, your household income's only gone up 1.6 times. We're actually not richer. And in fact, when you look at the statistics from this community, what we see is that we have more people living in poverty than ever before. We have more people who have negative net worth than ever before. We have an expanding gap between the median of the community and the upper 5 and 10% of the community. We actually have a development pattern that is saddling us with enormous liabilities without actually creating wealth in families and small businesses the way that our prior development pattern did. Yes, we have more stuff. Yes, we have bigger homes. Let me say this like an economist. Yes, we have more transactions, but we're not actually generating more wealth. We're not actually generating more stability. We're not actually generating more strength. I knew this was going to work out this way, and I recognize now what happened in my presentation. Someone took my presentation and put it into like a PDF thing. I'm going to get mad at whoever that was after we're done tonight. Because this is actually like, I've got like animations that go on here because you just got the big reveal and I actually have a build-up to this reveal. But I'm a professional, I can overcome. So we're gonna do this in a different way. This is an example to try to explain what is actually going on in our neighborhoods. Because I want you to recognize the way our development pattern actually destroys wealth instead of creates it. It creates a lot of transactions, right? And if you're an economist measuring the size of the economy, transactions are a really important part of that. But transactions are different than wealth. It's different than capacity. It's different than tax base. It's different than the things that we need here to maintain the stuff that we're building. So these 3 blocks here are the edge of my city in 1920. As my city was growing incrementally up, incrementally out, and becoming incrementally more intense, the next generation of out were these 3 blocks. So what you're looking at here, especially in that picture on the left, you're looking at the pop-up shack. Remember I showed you the 1871 pop-up shack? This is what the version of that would have looked like in 1920. And these 3 blocks here all looked like that. This was the far edge of town. Now, imagine yourself in 1920. You build this on the edge of town. This is kind of the cheapest commercial investment that someone in the community was going to make. Your hope at that point was that things would continue as they had for thousands of years around the world. And in time, more stuff would be built on the edge. Your land would become more valuable because it would become closer to the center of town. And that added value would allow you the finances to be able to either sell that property to someone who would redevelop it or yourself add on a second and third story. The building would become more intense, more ornate. We would have seen this thicken up over time. That's not what happened. These were built in the 1920s. Then we had the Great Depression. Then we had World War II. Then we had this new experiment that would just skip right over this and start building out on the edge. These 3 blocks have stagnated for almost a century. The block on the right used to look just like the block on the left. We got it torn down, and we were able to get a Taco John's to move in. I recognize that culturally you are not familiar with Taco John's. Is there anyone from the Midwest or Minnesota who's been to Taco John's? You're nodding. Yes. I think the best way to understand this, it's Norwegian Mexican food. So lots of bland cheddar cheeses, lots of salt. We love it. It's really fantastic. We were thrilled with getting Taco John's, right? We were absolutely thrilled because not only did we get rid of a block of blight, because that's what we called this, blight, but we were able to secure a brand new, kind of shiny new place. That place was able to have all the boxes checked on our development form. It met the zoning code, had the right amount of parking, it's got the right amount of floor area ratio, the sign meets the sign ordinance, it's got, ADA compliant bathrooms, commercial sprinkler system. They even talk them into putting green infrastructure in. That little area right there is some stormwater management. The sidewalk, the bike walk advocates talk them into putting in a sidewalk. The sidewalk ends right there, but they got that stretch, right? So as we look at this development, it checks every box of what we looked at as success. Now's the big reveal where I go through and show you the finances. So if you If you look at this, the thing that nobody bothered to ask, the thing that nobody looked at was the amount of value being created and destroyed. That block on the left, that old, run-down, junky, blighted block, that block that we are actively, even today, trying to get rid of, has a total value of $1.1 million. That block on the right, which is the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure investment, the same long-term cost to the community, is only worth $600,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional development pattern, that complex adaptive way of building cities. You're looking at it in its infant state after almost a century of decline and neglect. And financially, it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we're building brand new today. And everybody in this room knows what the future of that taco place is, right? 20 years from now, there'll be a new Taco John's up the road. This one will be a used car lot. 10 years after that, it will be boarded up, and we'll be trying to get something new put in there, right? We've all seen this. We've all experienced this. This is a really compelling example, and I think all the rest of my slides, oh no, good, these won't be screwed up. Nice. Taco John's is a really compelling example. The pushback that I get sometimes is, you're cherry picking, Chuck. You're showing us something, but this is not a pattern. And I want to show you that this is a pattern we see repeated over and over and over again. So what I'm going to show you is some work by a group out of Asheville, North Carolina. The organization's called Urban 3. They do productivity mapping and other financial analysis for cities. What I'm going to show you right now is a map of different cities' financial productivity. Here's the way to think about this. Think of a farmer going and spreading seed across a field. The parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, where you get the most like bushels per acre, that's the part of the farm field that's the most productive, right? So where in the city do you get the most value per acre? Where's the most productive parts of the city financially? And I start with Buffalo. This is Buffalo, New York. I start with Buffalo because I have a soft spot for Buffalo, but also Buffalo is one of these cities that has been in decline for decades. They have lost population every single year since the end of World War II. And if you go to Buffalo, you will see a city that has all the outward signs of decline, right? It does not look like it's prospering, particularly in the core downtown. But if you go to that core downtown and say, where's the most productive parts of Buffalo, you'll be standing right in the middle of it. And the higher these bars go, the more productive it is. So not only does the core of Buffalo, those old traditional incrementally built places, that complex adaptive framework, not only are those the most productive places in the city, but it absolutely dwarfs everything else around it. This is a pattern we see repeated in city after city after city. Urban 3 has modeled hundreds of these. Cities that are northern cities, cities that are southern cities, cities on water, cities away from water, cities on the coast, cities in the interior of the country, cities that are really huge, cities that are really small. We see the same pattern repeated over and over and over. Wherever you have that complex adaptive system, that incrementally built framework, that pre-depression pattern of development, you see tremendous amounts of financial productivity. And the further you go out in time from the end of World War II, the lower and lower and lower the productivity ultimately becomes. This is a universal pattern that we have seen now in literally hundreds and hundreds of cities. This makes me really sad. I wish there was some way I could show you this slide the way it's supposed to be shown, but we'll try to do it this way. I'm going to explain to you what's behind these images, because that's the map of your city. This is the map that I was part of a team putting together. I was an advisor to this team. So Urban 3 was invited to come here around 2015, 2016, and do an analysis of your community, where literally tasked with looking at every revenue stream the city had that was an ongoing revenue stream. So where's your property tax coming from? Where's your sales tax coming from? Where are your utility fees coming from? And then take into account every expense that was an ongoing expense. So where's your road maintenance? Where's your drainage maintenance? Where's your sewer and water maintenance? And all of these things were put together and mapped separately. So at the end of this year and change of doing this work, Urban 3 had put together about 3 dozen different maps that showed different areas of expense and different areas of revenue. And then at the end of this, all of these maps were mashed together. Uh-oh, is someone changing my presentation? All these maps were mashed together. And you end up with what is, in a sense, a profit and loss map for the city. What the map shows is properties that pay more in taxes and fees every year than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. And properties where the opposite is true. They require more over time to provide service and maintenance to than they will contribute to the overall tax base. So here's that map. Every place where you see blue is a property that is a net positive for the community financially. These are properties that pay more annually in taxes and in fees than they require in ongoing services. This holds with the pattern that we see in the productivity maps. So here's your core downtown. This little crescent of blue here are some of your poorer neighborhoods. I'm going to show this set of photos as examples of what these blue areas look like. You'll see that they don't pass an eye candy test, right? Like they don't exude prosperity. They don't look rich. They don't look profitable. But when we run the math, when we do the figures, they're incredibly so. All that stuff in red then. And you see, as you go further out, what happens is that the costs start to go up exponentially, and the development pattern starts to get more spread out, and so the revenue goes down in the same kind of way. So there's almost like a logarithmic thing that happens the further you go out. So all this stuff out here in red is stuff that costs you more long-term to provide ongoing service and maintenance to than it generates in revenue for the community. Obviously, this is the malls, the big box stores, the strip malls, the drive-through franchise restaurants, the windy cul-de-sac-y streets, all that stuff out on the edge. There's 2 subsidies at work here, and I'm going to name them right now, and I'm going to tell you again, I'm showing you your own community. Understand, I'm not showing you this because you're different than everybody else. I'm showing this because you're the same as everybody else. Every other city is going to have these same dynamics going on. There's 2 subsidies happening here. Subsidy number 1, the poor neighborhoods are subsidizing the affluent neighborhoods. That is a universal thing we see in the North American development pattern. The only exception are places that have undergone very intense gentrification. If we go to Washington, D.C., a lot of those core neighborhoods are now occupied by very wealthy people, and so you don't have that subsidy, but you had that subsidy during the transition phase. Subsidy number 2, future generations are subsidizing the present generation. And that is the omnipresent type of subsidy. I'm going to give you a number right now that I've published in my book. It's a very startling number. I've had a few people in your community argue with me about it. I'm happy to be argued with about it. But I'm going to give it to you anyway because this is the numbers that we came up with. And again, I'm just going to give it to you. The median family in Lafayette, when we did this study in 2015, paid $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. I realize there's other taxes that are paid, school district and what have you, but $1,500 to the city. In order for the city to make good on every promise that has been made, to maintain every pipe, fix every road, maintain every ditch, take care of every park, maintain every building, provide all the police protection and fire protection that were part of the covenant that we had when we moved here and pay our taxes in this community. In order for all those obligations to be met, the median family taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. If you remember back to the median household income, that's 1 out of every $5 a family makes. When you get sent to the city, just to maintain what we have. That's not going to happen. There's zero chance that that is going to happen. And so the huge backlog of road maintenance that prompted this study in 2015 has gone up by, I think, 2.5 times in the years since. Because every year, you as a community have to make a decision on what urgent need do we address, and what are all the other urgent needs we have that we let go. I'm going to give you one word, and then we're going to talk about it. That word is Detroit. When I bring up Detroit, I find that everybody has a narrative of what happened in Detroit. If you are a left-of-center person politically, there's an entire left-of-center narrative about Detroit that makes complete sense to you. If you are a right-of-center person politically, there's a whole right-of-center narrative about Detroit that makes perfect sense to you. Those two narratives have very little in common with each other, except for one point. And it's a point I hear over and over and over again. And that point of agreement is, my city is not Detroit. Let me give you my story of Detroit. My story is a little bit different. If we go back to the early 1900s and we look at Detroit, Detroit was one of the wealthiest cities in the entire world. It was one of the top 3 wealthiest cities in this country. You can go to Detroit today and you can see remnants of this everywhere. Massive buildings, just opulent, amazing. Go to the Detroit Opera House. If you picked up the Detroit Opera House and dropped it into Milan or Paris, it would not be out of place. Astounding buildings, amazing amounts of wealth. As Detroit was on its way to becoming the Motor City, it was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Detroit was also the first city to experiment with what would become the North American development pattern. They were the first city to have commuters live on the outskirts of town and drive in for work or drive out at the end of the day. They were the first city to run highways through the middle of their neighborhoods to facilitate that. They were the first city to, at a grand scale, go and tear down buildings in order to create parking lots and places to facilitate this development pattern. They were the first city to very aggressively start to grow outward. And when this country hit the Great Depression and cities literally started declaring bankruptcy, there was one city and kind of a satellite of cities adjacent to it that comparatively did really well, that being Detroit. And so by the time we got to the end of World War II and we were looking around for what the next version of America was going to be, every Rotary Club president, bank president, mayor, city council member from every podunk city around North America knew what they needed to do. They needed to copy the development pattern pioneered by our most successful city, that being Detroit. And that's exactly what we did. When you take a city like Detroit that was massively wealthy and you spread it out, driving up the costs while denuding the tax base, you get the insolvency of Detroit. To me, Detroit is not difficult to understand. It's not some weird place. It's not different than your place or my place. Detroit's just early. They're just 2 or 3 decades ahead of everybody else. It's just the way the math works. I wrote this at the end of chapter 3 in my book, and my mom called me up and said, she read my first book, and she called me up at the end of chapter 3, and she said, Chucky, this is a very depressing book. I said, Mom, keep reading. It gets a lot better. She will tell you that it gets a lot better. But this is tough stuff. And I give this to you because this is our starting point. This is where we're at today. And when we recognize that, it changes the conversation we have. In fact, it makes a lot of the conversations we're having seem very silly and very off topic. It changes how we look at things. So what I want to give you in the last few minutes that we have here today is some ways to adapt and adjust to this. How do we actually do things differently? And I'm going to give you 3 strategies. And I'm going to say that these are strategies, not solutions. Because right now, there's no playbook to fix this. No civilization has ever done this experiment that we've done, right? And the solution is not to go back to 1935, because no one wants to live in that. We have to start with what we have and figure out how to make it work. How do we get that complex adaptive system back and allow that to solve a lot of these nagging problems that we have? So I'm going to give you 3 things that will help us start to work towards a solution. Number 1, we need to get our complexity back, right? We need to allow our neighborhoods to respond to stress and opportunity and help us solve these problems. And so we need to allow the next increment of development intensity by right in every neighborhood in our community. And I just threw at you a little bit of jargon, so let me break this down. When we look at that complex adaptive system, what we see is that neighborhoods are allowed to evolve and change. Right now, our codes generally make that impossible. We lock our neighborhoods under glass. We say, if you're a single-family home neighborhood, you will always be a single-family home neighborhood. You know, world without end, you can't change, that's it. And cities that do that, neighborhoods that do that, have only one ultimate destination. And it doesn't matter if it takes a generation or 10 generations, the only destination you have is failure. We have to be able to rejuvenate our places. Let me make this even more concrete. If you have a neighborhood of single-family homes, there should be no real regulatory friction for that neighborhood evolving over the next generation into a neighborhood of duplexes. If that makes you uncomfortable, you're not fully grasping the weight of the problem and the challenge that we have. We have to allow our neighborhoods to evolve and change. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of caveat to this because we've all seen what change looks like in today's pattern of development. Today's pattern of development asks us to do one thing, freeze all of our neighborhoods, and all of that kind of pent-up demand then manifests in massive change in a few places. And your goal as a property owner is to not be that place that changes, right? I don't want to be upzoned. I don't want massive change. That's the wrong way of developing a city. What we need is to have a development pattern where no neighborhood is exempt from change, but no neighborhood experiences radical change. None of us should leave town for 10 years, come back, and find our neighborhood unrecognizable. That is also an unhealthy development pattern. That is also a development pattern that distorts our underlying economics, stagnates our communities, and leads to a bad destination. We have to allow our communities to flex and evolve and change, but not so radically that they gentrify, they kick people out, they disperse the wealth of the community outside of its boundaries. Simultaneously with allowing the complex adaptive system to start to take hold, we need to lower the bar of entry. We have created for a lot of, again, I'm going to say with a big heart, generous, well-intentioned reasons, a very high bar to entry to participate in our society. If you want to own a home, prior to the recent craziness of corporate buying of homes, let's go back 5 years, you had to be able to get a mortgage. Now you have to be able to outbid a Wall Street hedge fund. But 5 years ago, you had to be able to get a mortgage, right? What did that mean? That meant you have to have a certain credit score, you had a certain job history. That takes a whole bunch of people out of the game, right? That's a high bar of entry. This is not the bar of entry that our ancestors would have had. And I say ancestors in the broadest sense of the word. Around the world for thousands of years, our ancestors had a much lower bar of entry. This is something that in my community we call a tiny house. My ancestors in the same community would have called this a house. For some reason, we've taken the idea of a starter home and put adjectives on the front of it and said, this is really freaky if someone builds a 600 square foot house in our city. In fact, in my city, if you want to build a tiny house, you have to meet all the requirements of a house. Then you have to meet subpart A through M of the tiny house provisions, right? You have to go genuflect in front of the planning commission. You have to beg permission from your neighbors, all to build what is anybody throughout all of human history would have recognized as a starter home. And I want to challenge you today, go out to your older neighborhoods, especially the ones that have evolved a little bit, that maybe were a little bit more mature by the time we got to the Great Depression. Go look at them, and what you will see if you look close is the starter home embedded in a house that has been expanded onto. Because what happens here is that we start with a small little box, and we save a little bit of money, and we put an addition on the back. And then we have a kid, like my friend Kate over here did, and we put on a second story, right? There's a process here to mature this incrementally over time. When we deny this opportunity to people, what we say is that a whole segment of our population, by the way, the most entrepreneurial part of our population, does not get to participate as full citizens in our community. We rob ourselves of wealth. We rob ourselves of opportunity. We have the same opportunity to do this in a commercial standpoint. This is a photo from Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon, Michigan had a downtown that struggled. They had experienced a lot of population loss with deindustrialization. They had a downtown that they struggled to get tenants in. They tried all the subsidy approaches, and what they found is that they could pay outside businesses to come in and locate there, but they were going to fail at doing that. It was going to cost them more money than it was ever going to generate for them in wealth. Muskegon was desperate, and in their desperation, they did something really, really smart. They went out and they bought a bunch of storage sheds. They took a gap in their streetscape, so a place that had been just a parking lot that was underutilized. They lined the edge of it with these storage sheds. They painted them up funky colors, and they rent them out at extremely low cost to startup entrepreneurs. And understand what an entrepreneur is. I know some of you were at EntreCon, Quint's thing. I gave this presentation a couple years ago about what an entrepreneur is and how it's different from an investor. An investor is someone who puts money into a project expecting a return. An entrepreneur is a crazy person who doesn't know they can fail, right? And our communities are built by entrepreneurs. And what we want to do is we want to make it as easy as possible for those crazy people to try things out and have as low a stakes as possible when they fail. And so if you get into one of these storage sheds, there's no long-term commitment, there's no long-term lease. We want you to come in and try stuff, try and fail, try and fail, try and fail, figure it out. That's what these are about, lowering the bar of entry. If you go to Muskegon, Michigan today, what you're going to find is a downtown full of businesses. And a lot of those businesses are people who got their start here, got proof of concept here, and then were able to move into that larger structure, that bigger commitment, that larger intense undertaking because they had proof of concept. When we lower the bar of entry, we allow more people to participate, and we get much, much better outcomes. Final thing, we have to make a dramatic shift in how we think about public investment. I did a workshop before this evening, and we talked a lot about the public's role, the local government's role, and some of our leading institutions' role in driving change. And what we find is that, for the most part, we tend to orient around outside capital flows coming into our community. What's the program that the federal government has right now that we can tap into? What's the program that the state government has that we can tap into? Who is the outside developer that will come in and make an investment in our community? How much can we borrow from the bond market? We wind up being very vertically oriented around bringing money into the community. And we look at those projects as being really successful. The bigger the project, the more money we bring in, the more successful it is. This is a very backward way to look at economic development. In fact, it is a World War II economist way of looking at it, right? Not about building wealth, not about building capacity, but about transactions. How many transactions can we create? Yay, we're out of the Great Depression. Sure, hundreds of thousands of people are dying, but look at that GDP growth, right? It is very easy to generate transactions. It's very difficult to do things that actually build community wealth. So what we need to do is reorient our public investment strategy around where people struggle. Let me say this in very stark terms. I know we're getting close on time, right? Is that where you're, I mean, like, I'm waiting for you to, like, you're stretching. I'm going to say this, and this is going to sound like an extreme statement. I want you to think about it tomorrow, okay? Don't think about it right now. Listen to what I'm going to say after it, but I want you to think about it tomorrow in the context of everything else we've talked about. We should be done in this community building pipe, building new roads, building new infrastructure. We don't have the money to maintain even a fraction of what we've already built. The idea that we would build more is an insanity. It's crazy. And so what our challenge is now is not what's the next project we can build, but how do we go back and make better use of the stuff we've already built? How do we wring more value out of it? How do we get greater productivity out of the things we've already built? And that is a radically different investment strategy for our community. It's one based around getting better use of our existing investments. At Strong Towns, we have developed a 4-step approach to identifying and executing on the lowest risk, highest return public investments that we can make. I'm going to walk you through this approach right now. It is very, very simple. Step number 1, go out and humbly observe where people in the community struggle. Where do people have a difficult time using the city as it has been built? I'm going to emphasize humility here. If we go out with the federal program in mind or the state program in mind, we will find that need for that program. My community right now is obsessed with a children's museum. We're obsessed with a children's museum, not because there's a massive demand for a children's museum, because there's a state program to build children's museums. And so all of a sudden, every problem we have is being redefined as a problem that will be solved by a children's museum. I don't think a children's museum is a bad idea, but it's not where we're at right now today. And so go out with humility. Go out without a preconceived notion of what you're going to find, of what you think should be, and try to understand where people are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built for them. Step number 2 then, ask yourself the question, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Again, resist the temptation to come up with a solution. Resist the temptation to tap into some program or some big thing or say, 5 years from now, we got this capital improvements plan. We're going to come through and wipe this whole thing out and redo it. We'll fix it then. What is the thing that we can do this moment with straw bales and cones and duct tape and paint that will take this struggle that someone's having and not fix it, but make it a little bit easier? Step number 3 then, go do that thing. Do that thing right now. Don't send it to a committee. Don't bring in a consultant. Don't debate on it for 2 months. It's a tiny little thing. Just go do it. And then step number 4, repeat that process over and over and over. When we do this approach, what we find is that we have almost an infinite number of things to be done, all of which are within our budget and our capacity, all of which have very limited financial downside because they're very small things, but cumulatively taken together have massive financial upside. Simultaneous with this, we'll also improve people's lives. And really, as a local government, that's the sweet spot. That's like the community, that's where we want to be. That is the essence of a Strong Towns approach. We can make amazing investments in our neighborhoods that have very little financial risk, massive upside potential to attract investment, get money off the sidelines, get people connected to their neighborhoods and invested in their future, while also making people's lives better. We can continue on the path that we're on, and I apologize to anyone from Lawton. It's a very nice city full of very kind people, but I have to tell you, this project made me really sad. It made me really sad because they were very proud of it. Someone in their government had gone to some city, and that city was doing great, and that city had a new streetscape. And of course, there's a federal program to build streetscapes. So they put 2 and 2 together and said, all right, success, streetscape, program for streetscape, we need a streetscape. And they went out and applied, and they got a federal grant. Of course, they had to come up with millions of match themselves. And they built this streetscape. They got decorative lights, they got new sidewalks, they got street trees, and they got nothing else. Because this is not where their community was. This is not the urgent need they had. This is the project they wanted to do, but it was not the thing where people were struggling. It was not the thing that addressed what they really needed. I'm going to contrast that with one of my favorite cities, Memphis, Tennessee. This is Broad Avenue in Memphis. Broad Avenue is a former streetcar stop. In the 1950s, the streetcar got ripped out. Highway was run through the middle of the neighborhood. These blocks were just abandoned. It's been kind of steady decline. Some neighbors now, fed up with decline, fed up with neglect, went out. They swept out these stores. They worked with the property owners to get them kind of cleaned up a little bit. They went out with paint and painted a mural. They put in some crosswalks, some bike lanes. For one weekend, they did a little event where they invited businesses to come in and open up just to kind of show what could happen. They had a couple art galleries, they had a bike shop, they had a taco stand, they had an ice cream thing. They didn't ask for permission from the city. They didn't go get Department of Health inspections. They figured that by the time someone showed up and shut us down, we would be long gone anyway. They just went out and did it. I wasn't there for this project, but they brought me out there 6 months later. 6 months later, every single storefront on the street had a business in it. Some of the apartment buildings that had been unoccupied had tenants in them. I talked to one of the landlords, and the landlord said they were able to increase the rent by 50%. Now, you might say, well, rent, we don't want rent to go up. Yeah, when rent is zero, right? This is how communities build wealth, right? We do need rent to go up. We just need people in the neighborhood to get wealthy as part of that, right? The city's gone out and documented what has gone on here. Dozens of properties taken off the blighted list, been invested in, new businesses, millions of dollars of new private investment that have happened here. Total public investment initially in this project, zero. There's just some people out with some elbow grease, a little bit of paint. I'm not suggesting every project we do will turn out like this, but this is the kind of thing we should be looking for. How do we take these opportunities that we're overlooking in our obsession with the next big project or the next big thing or the next big program? How do we humble ourselves to go out and recognize where our neighbors are struggling, where the people in our community are having a difficult time? How do we humble ourselves to do this systematically over and over and over again? And then be confident that the street trees we plant and the crosswalks we paint and the cones we put out and the stuff that we do is not beneath us. That's what it feels like today, right? Like that we aspire to bigger things. No. We aspire to build a great place. That's where you start. It's not beneath us. It's the first step to something greater. Because if we can do this, what will happen is that people will start to respond. And we might go over here and be very humble and say, we see people struggling and we do something here and nothing happens. And you know what? We spend a little bit of time and a little bit of money and we learn something. That doesn't work there. There's a low price to pay for that mistake. But we try something else over here and it does happen. It does work. And now there's more people coming through here because we've done something of value. And we expand on that. We make it a little bit more permanent. Maybe we start to do a bigger project. We build ourselves up. We iterate. We get that complex feedback loop back again. And if we do this, not only can we make ridiculously profitable investments for our community, improving our bottom line, growing our wealth, growing our capacity, and having that capacity actually accrue to our neighbors and the families and the small businesses in our community. But we cannot help but make people's lives better every step of the way. That's what a Strong Towns approach is about. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to come here and share these ideas with you again. I will say, I talk about Lafayette a lot when I'm out in other places because you have all the elements of success. You have all the things here. I feel like what is needed, and this is why I'm here today, and I'm excited to be here, is the CivicCon process. To actually take these ideas that so many people in your community understand and know and put them to work for you. And if you do it, you're going to be an example for everybody else to follow. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you for being part of this.